The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Willow Creek, Montana, in the summer of 1875. But it wasn't the sound that made Delilah Lawson's heart stop. It was the realization that the beautiful porcelain doll her mother had given her before she died was gone, sold by her husband for another bottle of whiskey. Delilah stood in the center of her small cabin, staring at the empty shelves where her precious belongings once sat. The handcrafted quilt her grandmother had sewn, the silver-framed photograph of her parents, and the pearl hair combs she'd worn on her wedding day all vanished. 6 years of marriage to Thomas Lawson had taught her many painful lessons, but this betrayal cut deeper than his drunken fists ever had. With trembling fingers, she touched the fresh bruise blooming beneath her eye. At 24, Delilah had grown accustomed to hiding her injuries, to smiling through the pain when neighbors inquired about her welfare. She'd believed that loving Thomas enough would change him, that her dedication would overcome his demons. Now, surrounded by the hollow remnants of her life that hope finally shattered, the cabin door slammed open, wood cracking against the wall as Thomas stumbled inside. The stench of alcohol preceded him, his eyes bloodshot and narrowed with familiar rage. "What are you looking at?" He slurred, swaying on his feet. The bottle in his grip was already half empty, the amber liquid sloshing against the glass. "Got nothing better to do than stand there like some useless decoration." Delilah's throat tightened. "My mother's doll," she whispered. "How could you sell it?" "And my grandmother's quilt," Thomas laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "What good were they doing, collecting dust while we needed money?" He took another swig from the bottle. "Besides, a man's entitled to do what he wants with what's his, and you're mine, aren't you, Delilah?" "Those things weren't yours to sell," she said, her voice growing stronger despite the fear clutching at her chest. "They were all I had left of my family." His face darkened, the transformation happening in an instant the way it always did. "You ungrateful bitch," he growled, advancing toward her. "Everything under this roof belongs to me, including you." Delilah backed away, but there was nowhere to run in the small cabin. Her back hit the wall just as Thomas raised his hand. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the blow that would surely come, but the cabin door crashed open once more. "That's enough." The voice was deep, steady as stone. Delilah's eyes flew open to see a tall figure silhouetted in the doorway, the setting sun casting long shadows across the dirt floor. The stranger stepped inside, and she could make out his features now, a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, dark eyes that took in the scene with a calculating calm. "This ain't your business, mister," Thomas snarled, turning to face the intruder. "This is between me and my wife." "I'd say it became my business when I watched you sell her belongings at Harrington's store," the stranger replied evenly. "And it definitely became my business when I heard you bragging about how you'd teach her respect when you got home." The man moved further into the light, and Delilah noticed the star pinned to his vest. A lawman, though not one she recognized. "Name's Marshal Mitchell Nash," he said, his eyes never leaving Thomas. "Just arrived in town this morning." His hand rested casually near his holstered pistol. "Now I suggest you step away from the lady." Thomas's face twisted with rage. "You've got no right. I've got every right to enforce the law, Mr. Lawson. And while it might not be illegal to be a sorry excuse for a husband, assault most certainly is." The marshal's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the words. "I think it would be best if you took a walk to cool your head." For a moment, Delilah thought Thomas would lunge at the marshal. His fingers tightened around the whiskey bottle, knuckles turning white. But something in Marshal Nash's steady gaze must have given him pause. With a final venomous look at Delilah, he staggered toward the door. "This isn't over," he muttered as he passed the marshal. "For tonight it is," Nash replied. He watched until Thomas disappeared down the path toward town before turning to Delilah. She remained pressed against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Thank you," she managed, though the words seemed inadequate. The marshal removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "Are you hurt, Mrs. Lawson?" "No more than usual," she answered truthfully, then flushed at her own candor. His expression darkened momentarily. "Has anyone in town done anything about this before?" Delilah shook her head. "People don't interfere in marriage matters." Well, they should when it comes to this. He glanced around the sparse cabin, taking in the empty shelves. I saw him selling your things. I'm sorry I couldn't stop him, but by the time I realized what was happening, the transactions were done. It's not your fault. She moved away from the wall, straightening her simple dress. Thomas has been difficult since losing his job at the mine last year. The drinking just got worse. Marshal Nash studied her with those penetrating dark eyes. That's no excuse for hurting you or for selling your possessions. Delilah turned away, unable to meet his gaze. She'd heard similar sentiments from the preacher's wife and from the doctor who had set her broken wrist last winter. But words of sympathy changed nothing. Thomas would return, drunk and angrier than before. The cycle would continue. He won't touch you again. The quiet certainty in the marshal's voice made her look up. You don't know Thomas. He'll wait until you're gone, and then I won't be gone, Nash replied simply. I'll be staying at the boarding house in town. If he comes back tonight and causes trouble, fire a shot into the air. I'll hear it. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small revolver, offering it to her handle first. Do you know how to use this? Delilah hesitated. My father taught me before he passed. Good. It's loaded, so be careful. He placed it in her hands. The weapon was surprisingly light. Just a precaution. I'll check on you in the morning. As he turned to leave, Delilah found her voice again. Marshal, why are you helping me? You don't even know me. He paused at the doorway, his profile outlined against the darkening sky. Because no one should have to live in fear, Mrs. Lawson. Especially not in their own home. With that, he settled his hat back on his head and disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving Delilah alone with the small revolver and the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in years' hope. That night, Delilah slept fitfully, the revolver tucked beneath her pillow. Thomas didn't return, which worried her almost as much as the thought of him bursting through the door in a drunken rage. He had friends among the miners' rough men who shared his fondness for whiskey and his disdain for the law. What if they decided to teach the new marshal a lesson? She rose before dawn, her body aching with tension. After stoking the fire in the stove and putting on a pot of coffee, she washed her face carefully, wincing as the cloth touched the bruise beneath her eye. The mirror above the wash basin revealed what she already knew: no amount of careful styling could hide the evidence of Thomas's anger. A knock at the door startled her. It was barely past sunrise, too early for casual visitors. Cautiously, she retrieved the revolver from beneath her pillow before approaching the door. Who is it? She called, her finger resting near the trigger. Marshal Nash, Mrs. Lawson. Relief flooded through her as she unlatched the door. The marshal stood on her porch, his expression grim in the early morning light. May I come in? He asked, removing his hat. Delilah stepped back, suddenly conscious of her simple appearance, her hair loosely braided for sleep, her faded house dress. Of course, I was just making coffee. Coffee would be welcome. He entered, his tall frame making the cabin seem even smaller. His gaze lingered briefly on the revolver in her hand before meeting her eyes. I see you kept it close. Yes, she admitted, setting the weapon on the table, though I didn't need it. Thomas never came home. The marshal's jaw tightened. That's what I came to tell you. Thomas Lawson is in my jail cell. Delilah froze, the coffee pot halfway to the table. What happened? He and 3 others thought they'd welcome me to town by beating me senseless behind the saloon. A faint smile touched his lips. They were unsuccessful. Now that she looked more closely, Delilah could see a darkening bruise along his jawline and a small cut above his left eyebrow. Yet he carried himself as if uninjured, his posture straight and strong. Are you all right? She asked, concerned. I've had worse from better men, he replied dismissively. Your husband, however, will be facing charges for assault on a federal marshal. The judge arrives next week. Until then, he'll stay in my jail. Delilah set the coffee pot down with shaking hands and sank into a chair. Thomas in jail for a week. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, followed swiftly by fear. When he gets out, that's what I wanted to discuss with you. Marshal Nash took the seat opposite her, his expression serious. Mrs. Lawson, I can keep him locked up for a time, but eventually he'll be released. You need to consider what you'll do then. Do, Delilah echoed. What can I do? He's my husband. You could leave, Nash suggested gently. Start fresh somewhere else. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Leave Willow Creek, leave Thomas. Women didn't simply abandon their marriages, no matter how unbearable. What would people say? Where would she go? How would she survive? I have nowhere to go, she admitted quietly. No family, very little money of my own. You have skills, though, he pointed out. I asked around town this morning. Folks say you're the finest seamstress in the county. Delilah flushed at the compliment. I enjoy sewing. It doesn't mean I could support myself with it. In a growing town like Silver Springs, you might. It's about 3 days' ride from here. He leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Lawson, please call me Delilah, he nodded. Delilah, I've seen too many women trapped in situations like yours. It rarely ends well. His eyes, dark and earnest, held hers. You deserve better than living in fear. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine it a small shop of her own, perhaps, with a room in the back where she could sleep without worrying about drunken fists or cruel words. Freedom. Safety. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course. He rose to his feet, towering over her small table. But don't think too long. The judge might only give him 30 days. That's not much time to make preparations. As he reached the door, she found herself calling after him. Marshal Nash. He turned, eyebrows raised in question. Thank you, not just for handling Thomas, but for believing I could start over. She managed a small smile. Not many would. Then not many have truly seen you, Delilah Lawson. With that, he settled his hat back on his head and stepped out into the morning light. Delilah stared at the closed door long after he'd gone, her coffee cooling beside her. Start over. The words echoed in her mind, frightening and thrilling all at once. Could she really do it? Leave behind everything she knew for an uncertain future. And why did the thought of the marshal's dark, steady eyes make her heart beat faster than it had in years? The following days passed in a strange, suspended state. Without Thomas in the cabin, Delilah found herself breathing easier. She slept through the night for the first time in months. She ate when she was hungry instead of waiting anxiously for Thomas to finish first. Small freedoms, but they felt enormous. Marshal Nash checked on her daily, sometimes bringing supplies from town flour, coffee, even fabric scraps from the general store that she could use for her sewing. She told him it wasn't necessary, but he insisted. Consider it compensation, he said one afternoon, setting a basket of provisions on her table. For the things your husband sold. I spoke with Mr. Harrington at the store. He's agreed to hold the items he purchased until you can buy them back if you wish. Delilah looked up from the shirt she was mending one of the Marshal's, torn during his altercation with Thomas. That's very kind of him, and you, Nash shrugged, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. It's the decent thing to do. He gestured to the shirt in her hands. You don't have to fix that, I can get another. I don't mind, she assured him. It's good to keep my hands busy, helps me think. About leaving, he asked directly. She nodded, securing her thread with a neat knot. I've been considering it. But it's frightening, the idea of being completely alone. You wouldn't be entirely alone. He cleared his throat. I've been meaning to tell you. I received a telegram yesterday. I'm being reassigned to Silver Springs once the judge arrives and your husband's case is settled. Delilah's needle paused halfway through the fabric. Oh, the town's growing. They need a permanent marshal, not just a circuit rider. He watched her carefully. If you decided to relocate there, you'd at least know one person. The implication hung in the air between them, an offer of continued protection, perhaps friendship. Something warmed in Delilah's chest at the thought. I'll consider it, she said softly, returning to her stitching. Nash nodded, seemingly satisfied. He moved to the window, gazing out at the mountains that bordered the small mining town. It's a nice place, Silver Springs. Good people. Growing fast, but not so fast that a newcomer would feel lost. Do you have family there? Delilah asked, realizing how little she knew about this man who had so dramatically altered her life. No family anywhere, he replied, still looking outward. My parents died when I was young, raised by an uncle who didn't much care for raising children. A faint smile touched his lips. Joined the army at 16, lied about my age, served through the war, became a marshal after. So you're used to being alone, Delilah observed. He turned to face her then, his expression thoughtful. Being alone and being lonely aren't always the same thing, Delilah. The way he said her name soft, almost reverent, sent an unexpected shiver through her. It was improper, this growing awareness of him as a man rather than simply as her protector. She was still married, after all, even if her husband was currently behind bars. "I should go," Nash said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Got to make my rounds before dark." He left quickly, and Delilah sat holding his mended shirt long after he'd gone, her fingers tracing the careful stitches as her mind raced with possibilities and her heart with dangerous feelings. The judge arrived in Willow Creek exactly 1 week after Thomas's arrest, a stern-faced man named Hollister who conducted court proceedings in the town's small church. Delilah sat in the back row, a shawl draped over her head partly to ward off the autumn chill and partly to obscure her still visible bruises. Thomas looked smaller somehow, standing before the judge with his hands shackled. His usual bravado had faded after a week in the cramped jail cell. When he caught sight of Delilah, his expression darkened momentarily before settling into a calculated contrition. Marshal Nash presented the charges: clearly assault on a federal officer, public drunkenness, destruction of property at the saloon where the fight had begun. He made no mention of Thomas's treatment of Delilah, and she was simultaneously relieved and disappointed. Part of her wanted the whole town to know what happened behind their cabin door, while another part shrank from the public exposure of her shame. When Thomas spoke, his voice dripped with remorse. "I deeply regret my actions, Your Honor. The whiskey got the better of me, as it sometimes does. I'm a hard-working man fallen on difficult times since the mine cut back." He glanced at Delilah. "I've got a wife to support. I'm asking for your mercy." Judge Hollister was unimpressed. "Mr. Lawson, assaulting a federal marshal is a serious offense. Your contrition now doesn't erase your actions." He shuffled through some papers before continuing. 30 days in the territorial prison and a fine of $50. The sentence hit Delilah like a physical blow. 30 days, just as Marshal Nash had predicted. 1 month to decide her future, to either leave or face Thomas's inevitable rage when he returned. As the small crowd dispersed after the proceedings, Thomas was led past her by Marshal Nash. He paused, his eyes finding hers. "I'll be back home before you know it, Delilah," he said, his gentle tone belied by the cold threat in his gaze. "You'll keep everything in order, won't you, like a good wife should?" Before she could respond, Nash firmly guided him forward. "Keep moving, Lawson." Outside the church, Delilah waited until the wagon carrying Thomas and the marshal to the territorial prison disappeared from view before allowing her shoulders to slump. 30 days suddenly seemed like no time at all. Mrs. Lawson. She turned to find Harriet Weaver, the preacher's wife, standing nearby with a sympathetic expression. "I couldn't help overhearing," the older woman said gently. "If you need anything while Thomas is away, please don't hesitate to ask." Delilah managed a polite smile. "That's very kind, Mrs. Weaver. It's a difficult situation," Harriet continued, lowering her voice. "Everyone knows Thomas has his troubles, but marriage is a sacred commitment. With prayer and patience, perhaps he'll find his way back to being the man you married." The well-meaning words scraped against Delilah's raw nerves. The man she'd married had shown his true nature within months of their wedding. No amount of prayer had stopped his fists or stemmed the flow of whiskey down his throat. "Perhaps," she murmured, unwilling to debate the matter. "If you'll excuse me, I should get home before dark." As she walked the dusty road to her cabin, Delilah's mind whirled with indecision. Stay or go, endure or escape, the safe, familiar misery of life with Thomas, or the terrifying unknown of a new beginning. By the time she reached her door, she'd made no progress in her decision, but when she entered the cabin, she froze in surprise. On her table sat a familiar object, her mother's porcelain doll, its painted face seeming to smile at her in welcome. Beside it lay a note in a strong, masculine hand. "One treasure returned, the rest to follow. Amen." Tears sprang to Delilah's eyes as she cradled the doll, her fingers tracing the delicate features. How had he managed it? Had he paid Harrington himself? Or somehow convinced the storekeeper to return it in that moment, holding the precious memento she'd thought lost forever? Delilah Lawson made her decision. She would not be waiting when Thomas Lawson returned from prison. She would be gone, starting a new life where he couldn't reach her. And perhaps, just perhaps, that new life might include the man who had returned her treasures and shown her that kindness could exist without conditions. The following morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect late September day. Delilah rose early, determined to begin preparations for her departure. She had precious little to pack her clothes, some cooking utensils, her sewing supplies. Most of her personal treasures were still at Harrington's store, but the doll would travel with her, carefully wrapped in one of her shawls. A knock at her door interrupted her inventory. Expecting Marshal Nash, she was surprised to find Mrs. Weaver on her doorstep instead, holding a covered basket. "Good morning, Delilah," the preacher's wife greeted her warmly. "I brought some fresh bread and preserves. May I come in?" "Of course." Delilah stepped back, hastily trying to hide the evidence of her packing. "It's very kind of you to visit." Mrs. Weaver's sharp eyes took in the half-filled traveling bag on the bed. Her expression shifted from friendly to concerned. "You're not thinking of leaving, are you, dear?" Delilah hesitated, torn between honesty and discretion. "I'm considering my options." The older woman set her basket down with a sigh. "I was afraid of this when I saw how that new marshal was hovering around you." She fixed Delilah with a stern look. "People are talking, you know. It's not proper. A married woman receiving so many visits from a single man, regardless of his position." Heat rose to Delilah's cheeks. "Marshal Nash has been kind enough to check on my welfare, nothing more." "Perhaps that's how you see it," Mrs. Weaver replied, her tone softening slightly. "But others might interpret it differently. And what about your marriage vows? For better or worse, in sickness and in health. Thomas has his faults, serious ones, I grant you, but abandoning your husband while he's imprisoned is hardly the Christian response." Delilah felt a flare of anger at the simplistic view. "And what is the Christian response to having my belongings sold for whiskey, or to being struck whenever his temper flares? Tell me, Mrs. Weaver, where in our marriage vows did I promise to be Thomas's punching bag, Mrs.?" Weaver flinched at the harsh words. "I didn't realize it was that bad," she admitted quietly. "Why didn't you say something sooner? Would it have made a difference?" Delilah asked wearily. "Would your husband have intervened? Would anyone in town have stood against Thomas and his drinking companions?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Mrs. Weaver fidgeted with her basket, clearly uncomfortable. "What will you do? Where will you go?" "I haven't decided yet," Delilah lied, unwilling to reveal her plans. "The fewer people who knew her destination, the better. But I won't be here when Thomas returns." "I see." Mrs. Weaver's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, I can't say I approve, but I understand your reasoning better now." She reached out to pat Delilah's hand. "Whatever you decide, may God watch over you, child." After the preacher's wife departed, Delilah sat heavily on her bed. The visit had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Was she truly doing the wrong thing by leaving? Was breaking her marriage vows a sin that would follow her forever? She was still pondering these questions when another knock came at her door late that afternoon. This time it was Marshal Nash, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. "You're back," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I thought you'd be gone longer, escorting the prisoners." "Deputy Haynes took them the rest of the way," he explained, stepping inside when she gestured. "I wanted to return quickly." His eyes traveled to her half-packed bag. "You've decided then?" Delilah nodded, closing the door. "Yes, but Mrs. Weaver visited today. She saw my preparations." She glanced up at him worriedly. "She said people are talking about your visits here, that it's improper." Nash's expression hardened slightly. "People will always talk. It shouldn't stop you from doing what's necessary for your safety." "I know, but—" She hesitated. "She reminded me of my marriage vows, that I promised before God to stay with Thomas for better or worse." "Did you also vow to let him hurt you?" Nash asked quietly. "To surrender everything you own to feed his thirst for whiskey?" "No, but Delilah." He moved closer, his dark eyes intense. "A vow made under false pretenses isn't binding. The man you married showed you one face, then revealed another once you were trapped. That's not a sacred contract, it's a prison sentence." His words resonated with something deep inside her, a truth she'd been afraid to acknowledge. Thomas had courted her with gentle words and promises of devotion. The violence hadn't started until after the wedding, when he'd already secured her as his property. "Thank you for the doll," she said, changing the subject. "How did you get Mr. Harrington to return it?" A slight smile crossed Nash's face. "I paid him what Thomas received, plus a little extra for his trouble." "You shouldn't have done that," Delilah protested. "I'll repay you. Consider it a parting gift." He glanced around the small cabin. "When do you plan to leave?" "Tomorrow," she decided suddenly. "The morning stage to Carson City, then on to Silver Springs." She met his gaze steadily. "I assume you'll be following once your duties here are concluded." "Within the week," he confirmed. "I need to brief my replacement and tie up some loose ends." He hesitated before adding, "I'm glad you chose Silver Springs. It's a good place for a fresh start." Something in his tone made Delilah's heart quicken. Was he merely pleased she'd be safe, or was there another reason he wanted her in the same town? "I'll need to find work immediately," she said, pushing aside such thoughts. "And lodging." "I took the liberty of writing ahead to a friend who runs the hotel there," Nash replied. "Mrs. Sullivan is a good woman. She's offering you a job as the hotel seamstress with a room included until you get settled." Delilah stared at him, astonished. "You arranged all that before knowing my decision," he shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "I hoped you'd choose to leave, wanted to make it easier if you did." Gratitude and something warmer flooded through her. This virtual stranger had done more to help her in a week than anyone had in years. "I don't know how to thank you." "Live well," he said simply. "That's thanks enough." As he turned to leave, Delilah impulsively reached out to touch his arm. "Marshal Mitchell," he corrected gently. "If we're to be neighbors in Silver Springs, you might as well use my given name." "Mitchell," she repeated, liking the feel of it on her tongue. "Will you see me off tomorrow? The stage leaves at 9. His expression softened. "I'll be there." After he left, Delilah returned to her packing with renewed purpose. Tomorrow would mark the end of Delilah Lawson, the beaten wife of a drunken miner, and the beginning of something else, something hopeful, something free. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of genuine anticipation for what the future might hold. The stagecoach rattled and swayed along the mountain road, jostling its passengers with each rut and stone. Delilah pressed her forehead against the window glass, watching Willow Creek fade into the distance. 6 years of her life left behind in that small mining town some happy memories, but far more painful ones. Her fellow travelers included a silver-haired couple returning to Carson City after visiting their daughter, a young man heading west to seek his fortune in the silver mines, and a traveling salesman with a case of patent medicines. They chatted amiably, but Delilah contributed little to the conversation, lost in her own thoughts. The moment of departure had been both harder and easier than expected. Harder because, despite everything, Willow Creek had been her home. She'd left the cabin key with Mrs. Weaver, along with a letter for Thomas explaining that she wouldn't return. The preacher's wife had embraced her with tears in her eyes, whispering, "May you find peace, child." Easier because Mitchell Nash had been there as promised, helping her with her bags and ensuring she had a comfortable seat. Just before the stage departed, he'd handed her a small package. "Something to read on the journey," he'd said, "and a reminder." Inside, she'd found a slim volume of poetry Tennyson's In Memoriam, with a pressed wildflower marking a particular page. The lines he'd subtly indicated read, "Ring out the old, ring in the new, /ring, happy bells across the snow, / the year is going, let him go, / ring out the false, ring in the true. Ring out the false, ring in the true." The words echoed in her mind as the mountains rose around them, magnificent and enduring. Leaving Thomas wasn't just about escaping violence. It was about choosing truth over lies, authenticity over pretense. For too long, she'd lived a false life, pretending her marriage was salvageable, that Thomas would change, that her love could overcome his demons. The journey to Silver Springs took 3 days, with overnight stops in Carson City and Pineville. By the time the stagecoach rolled into her destination, Delilah was exhausted but exhilarated. Silver Springs proved larger than Willow Creek, with proper boardwalks lining the main street and buildings constructed of brick rather than just timber. She counted 2 hotels, several saloons, a bank, and numerous shops as the stage made its way to the depot. "Silver Springs," called the driver as the coach lurched to a stop. "End of the line, folks." Delilah gathered her belongings, accepting the driver's assistance down the high step. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. People bustled along the street, their purposeful energy a stark contrast to the languid pace of Willow Creek. "You must be Mrs. Lawson," said a voice behind her. Delilah turned to find a tall, handsome woman in her 50s approaching with a welcoming smile. Her dark hair was streaked with silver and pulled into a practical knot, and she carried herself with unmistakable authority. "I am," Delilah confirmed, extending her hand. "Are you Mrs. Sullivan?" "Indeed I am. Margaret Sullivan, owner of the Silver Springs Hotel." She clasped Delilah's hand warmly. "Marshal Nash wrote such a glowing letter about your seamstress skills that I feel I'm getting the better end of our arrangement." Delilah flushed. "He's been very kind." "Mitch Nash doesn't waste kindness on those who don't deserve it," Mrs. Sullivan remarked, signaling to a young boy to collect Delilah's bags. "Come along, my dear. You must be exhausted from your journey. We'll get you settled in your room and you can rest before dinner." The Silver Springs Hotel stood 3 stories tall, its facade freshly painted white with green trim. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished wood and brass fixtures. A magnificent staircase curved up to the upper floors, and comfortable seating areas invited guests to linger. Mrs. Sullivan led her past the front desk, nodding to the clerk on duty. "This is Mrs. Lawson, Daniel. She'll be taking over the seamstress duties from Mrs. Clancy." "Welcome to Silver Springs, madam," the young man said politely. They continued through a door marked private into the hotel's back regions. Here, the opulence gave way to functionality, narrow corridors, simple furnishings, rooms clearly meant for staff rather than guests. "This will be your workshop, Mrs. Sullivan announced, opening a door to reveal a bright room with large windows. A sturdy sewing table occupied the center, while shelves lined with fabrics and notions covered one wall. "And through here," she opened a connecting door, "is your private room." The bedroom was small but charming, with a single bed, a washstand, a wardrobe, and a rocking chair near the window. Someone had placed a vase of late blooming wildflowers on the small table. "It's lovely," Delilah breathed, overcome by the simple comfort of the space. After years in the drafty cabin with Thomas, this room felt like a palace. "It's not much, but it's private and convenient to your work," Mrs. Sullivan said. "You'll take your meals with the staff in the kitchen, though you're welcome to eat in your room if you prefer. Your duties will primarily involve mending linens and guests' clothing, but I'd also like you to help with the making of new curtains and bed covers as needed." "Of course," Delilah agreed eagerly. "I'm happy to do whatever is required." Mrs. Sullivan's expression softened. "Mitch explained your situation not in detail, but enough for me to understand you're starting fresh. Silver Springs is a good place for new beginnings. People here mind their own business for the most part." "Thank you for the opportunity," Delilah said sincerely. "I won't let you down." "I'm sure you won't." The older woman moved toward the door. "Rest now. Dinner is served in the kitchen at 6. If you need anything before then, just ring for Daniel." Left alone, Delilah sank onto the bed, running her hands over the clean, soft quilt, her own room, her own work. Her own life, answerable to no one but herself. The freedom was dizzying. For the first time since leaving Willow Creek, she allowed herself to weep not from sorrow, but from overwhelming relief. The tears came in great, heaving sobs that purged years of fear and tension from her body. When they finally subsided, she felt lighter, as if she'd shed not just tears but the weight of her past. Rising, she unpacked her few belongings, placing her mother's doll on the small shelf above the bed. She washed her face in the basin, changed her travel-stained dress for a fresher one, and brushed her hair until it shone. The woman in the small mirror looked different, somehow the same features, but animated by a new spirit. The bruise beneath her eye had faded to a yellowish shadow, the last visible mark of Thomas's cruelty. Soon, she thought, there would be no marks left at all. The days quickly fell into a comfortable rhythm. Delilah rose early, breakfasted in the kitchen with the hotel staff, then spent her days in the bright workshop, mending and creating. Mrs. Sullivan proved to be a fair employer, generous with praise and constructive in her criticism. The other staff members, from Daniel, the desk clerk, to Eliza the head chambermaid, to Wang the Chinese cook, welcomed her into their little community. Within 2 weeks, she'd not only caught up with the backlog of mending, but had also designed and begun sewing new curtains for the hotel dining room, earning Mrs. Sullivan's delighted approval. Several hotel guests, impressed with her work on their damaged garments, commissioned additional pieces. With careful budgeting, Delilah began setting aside a small sum from each payment, building her first ever personal savings. Each night, she fell asleep in her snug room with a sense of accomplishment and security she'd never known in her marriage. The only shadow on her contentment was the absence of Mitchell Nash. According to Mrs. Sullivan, the new marshal had been delayed in Willow Creek, but was expected any day. Delilah tried not to examine too closely why his arrival mattered so much to her. She was, after all, still legally married to Thomas, who had just over 2 weeks remaining on his sentence. The thought of him discovering her whereabouts and coming after her occasionally disrupted her newfound peace, but she pushed such fears aside. Thomas was unlikely to expend the effort to track her down when whiskey was more easily obtained. On a crisp October morning, almost 3 weeks after her arrival in Silver Springs, Delilah was fitting a hotel guest for a dress alteration when Mrs. Sullivan appeared at the workshop door. "You have a visitor," she announced, eyes twinkling. Delilah looked up, pins held carefully between her lips. She removed them, placing them in the cushion on her wrist. "A visitor for me, indeed. A rather tall, handsome visitor wearing a marshal's badge." Mrs. Sullivan winked. "Shall I send him in?" Heart suddenly racing, Delilah nodded, hastily smoothing her hair and straightening her apron. "Yes, please. If you could give us a moment, Mrs. Henderson, I'll finish your fitting shortly." The elderly guest smiled knowingly. "Take your time, dear." Young folks should have their moments. She patted Delilah's hand and followed Mrs. Sullivan out. Moments later, Mitchell Nash filled the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame. He'd trimmed his beard since she'd last seen him, and his dark hair was freshly cut. The silver at his temples caught the morning light. "Delilah," he said, his deep voice warming her name in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. "Mitchell." She stood frozen by her work table, suddenly shy. "You're finally here." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Got delayed sorting out some business in Willow Creek." His eyes roamed her face. "You look well, happy." "I am," she admitted. "Mrs. Sullivan has been wonderful. The work is satisfying, I feel." She searched for the right word. "Free," he suggested. "Yes," she breathed. "Exactly that." He moved closer, setting his hat on the edge of her work table. "I'm glad. That's all I wanted for you." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. This man, who barely knew her, had changed the course of her life through simple decency and kindness. "Thank you for the book," she said softly. "The poetry is beautiful. It helped me once after the war." His eyes held hers. "Reminded me that even after great loss, life continues. Changes form, finds new paths." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Delilah was acutely aware of his proximity, of the quiet strength he radiated, so different from Thomas's volatile energy. "I should let you get back to work," he said suddenly, breaking the moment. "I just wanted to see for myself that you were settled in properly." "I am," she assured him. "Though I've worried occasionally about Thomas discovering where I've gone." Mitchell's expression hardened slightly. "That's partly what delayed me. I wanted to make sure he wouldn't follow your trail." He hesitated. "There's something you should know. Thomas was released early for good behavior." Fear flashed through her. "When?" "4 days ago," but he added quickly, seeing her alarm, "He won't be coming here, I made sure of it." "How?" Delilah asked, both curious and apprehensive. Mitchell's jaw tightened. "I intercepted him as he was leaving the prison. We had a conversation. I made it very clear what would happen if he ever tried to find you or harm you again." She could imagine the scene, Mitchell towering over Thomas, his voice low and dangerous, the implicit threat in his stance. "What did he say?" He blustered at first. "Talked about his rights as your husband." Mitchell's mouth curved in a grim smile. Then I showed him the divorce papers I'd had drawn up, told him he could either sign them and forget your existence or face charges for every bruise he ever gave you. Delilah gasped. Divorce papers, but how? Judge Hollister is an old friend. When I explained your situation, he was sympathetic. Mitchell reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. Thomas signed. The judge finalized it yesterday before I left. With trembling fingers, Delilah took the paper. There it was in black and white, her freedom, legally documented. No longer Delilah Lawson, wife of Thomas, just Delilah. I don't know what to say, she whispered, tears blurring her vision. You don't have to say anything, Mitchell replied gently. You deserved your freedom. I just helped with the legal formalities. She looked up at him, this man who had done so much for a woman he barely knew. Why? The question that had burned in her mind for weeks finally escaped her lips. Why go to such lengths for me? Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. Because from the moment I saw you in that cabin, trying to stand tall despite your fear, I recognized something in you that called to something in me. He took a deep breath. My mother lived your life, Delilah. Married to a man who drank away every penny and used his fists to assert his authority. She died of it, a beating gone too far when I was 14. Horror and understanding washed over Delilah. I'm so sorry. I couldn't save her, he continued, his voice rough with old grief. But when I saw you, I thought maybe I could help at least one woman escape that fate. His expression softened. And then I got to know you, your courage, your kindness, despite everything you'd endured. It became about more than just righting an old wrong. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Delilah's heart hammered against her ribs. It was too soon, too complicated, and yet, something about Mitchell Nash felt right in a way nothing in her life ever had before. A knock at the door interrupted the charged moment. Mrs. Henderson peeked in hesitantly. So sorry to intrude, but I have an appointment at the photographer's studio in 20 minutes. Of course, Delilah said quickly, composing herself. Please come in, we're nearly finished. Mitchell retrieved his hat. I should go. Got to check in at my new office. He paused at the door. Perhaps you'd join me for supper this evening. There's a decent restaurant down the street. 7 o'clock. I'd like that, Delilah replied, conscious of Mrs. Henderson's interested gaze. With a tip of his hat, Mitchell departed, leaving Delilah to finish her fitting with hands that trembled slightly and a heart full of new possibilities. That evening, as Delilah prepared for her supper with Mitchell, she found herself giving unusual attention to her appearance. The woman in the mirror was changing, not just in the fading of bruises or the healthier glow to her skin, but in the way she carried herself, the confidence in her eyes. She chose her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranged her hair in a more flattering style than her usual practical knot. Mrs. Sullivan had loaned her a drop of lavender water, which she dabbed behind her ears. My goodness, exclaimed Eliza when Delilah emerged from her room. You look beautiful, Mrs. Lawson. Thank you, Delilah replied with a smile. And please just call me Delilah. I'm not Mrs. Lawson anymore. The news of her divorce had spread quickly among the hotel staff, met with universal approval. Even Mrs. Sullivan had remarked that some marriages were better dissolved than endured. Mitchell was waiting in the hotel lobby, looking uncommonly handsome in a clean white shirt and dark waistcoat, his marshal's badge polished to a shine. When he saw her, a look of undisguised admiration crossed his face. You're a vision, he said simply. Delilah blushed, unused to such straightforward compliments. Thank you. You clean up rather nicely yourself, Marshal. The restaurant was busy but pleasant, with white cloths on the tables and a small vase of flowers at each setting. They were shown to a corner table, somewhat removed from the other diners. Conversation flowed easily between them as they enjoyed their meal. Mitchell told her about his years in the army, his decision to become a lawman, the various towns he'd served before Willow Creek. Delilah shared stories of her childhood in Missouri, her father's work as a blacksmith, her mother's talent for embroidery that had inspired Delilah's own love of needlework. What would you like to do eventually? Mitchell asked as they lingered over coffee and apple pie. Stay at the hotel or perhaps open your own shop someday, the question startled her. Before Thomas, she'd had dreams of her own business, but those ambitions had been buried beneath years of merely trying to survive her marriage. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," she admitted. "Though I do love the idea of my own shop someday." "You'd be good at it," he said with conviction. "Mrs. Sullivan says you've already got half the hotel guests commissioning special items." "She exaggerates," Delilah demurred, though secretly pleased. "But yes, I'd like that eventually. To create beautiful things and be my own mistress." Mitchell smiled. "I like that about you, Delilah. You may have been knocked down, but you're still looking to the horizon." The simple observation touched her deeply. Thomas had always belittled her dreams, treating them as foolish fantasies. Mitchell not only acknowledged them, but seemed to believe in them in her. As they walked back to the hotel in the cool evening air, Mitchell offered his arm. Delilah took it, hyper-aware of his solid warmth beside her, the gentle way he slowed his long strides to match her pace. "I had a lovely evening," she said as they reached the hotel's side entrance where staff typically came and went. "So did I." He turned to face her, his expression earnest in the lamplight. "Delilah, I know it's too soon, perhaps, but I'd like to keep seeing you, if you're willing." Her heart fluttered. "I'd like that too," he smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Then, with a gentleness that nearly undid her, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Delilah." "Good night, Mitchell," she whispered. She watched him walk away, her hand still tingling from the touch of his lips. For the first time in years, Delilah felt not just safe or content, but truly, vibrantly alive. The weeks that followed took on a golden quality in Delilah's memory, a time of healing and discovery, of cautious steps toward something new and precious. Mitchell courted her with an old-fashioned formality that honored her need for time and space. They dined together several evenings a week, took Sunday afternoon walks through the town and its surrounding hills, and occasionally attended community gatherings where his position as marshal and her growing reputation as a skilled seamstress ensured a warm welcome. To Delilah's delight, Silver Springs proved to be exactly the fresh start she'd hoped for. No one knew her as Thomas Lawson's battered wife. They knew her only as the hotel's talented seamstress with the gentle smile and quiet dignity. If people gossiped about her growing relationship with the handsome new marshal, they did so kindly. By December, Delilah had saved enough to rent a small storefront just off the main street. With Mrs. Sullivan's blessing and continued offer of lodging, she began preparations to open her own dress shop after the new year. Mitchell helped her paint the walls and build shelves, his large hands surprisingly deft with the delicate work. "What will you call it?" he asked one evening as they stood back to admire their handiwork. Delilah considered the bright, welcoming space. "New beginnings," she decided. "It seems fitting." He smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Over the past weeks, they had grown more comfortable with such casual touches, a hand at her elbow, fingers briefly intertwined, his palm warm against the small of her back. Each contact sent sparks through her, awakening feelings she'd thought long dead. "Perfect," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. As Christmas approached, Silver Springs transformed with decorations and festive preparations. The hotel hosted a grand dinner for its staff on Christmas Eve, with Mrs. Sullivan presiding at the head of the table like a benevolent queen. Wung outdid himself with a feast that left everyone loosening their belts, and Daniel produced a fiddle for carols afterward. Delilah found herself swept into the celebration with a joy she hadn't felt during the holidays in years. Thomas had always drunk heavily at Christmas, turning what should have been a season of peace into one of heightened tension. This year, surrounded by people who genuinely cared for her, she rediscovered the magic of the season. Mitchell arrived as the singing concluded, dusted with snow from his evening rounds. His eyes sought hers immediately, warming when he found her among the revelers. "Merry Christmas, Marshal," called Mrs. Sullivan, gesturing him to an empty seat. "You're just in time for pie." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied, removing his hat and coat before joining them. Later, as the party broke up and people drifted to their rooms or homes, Mitchell drew Delilah aside. "Would you walk with me?" he asked quietly. "I know it's cold, but it's a beautiful night." Curious, she fetched her warmest shawl and accompanied him outside. Fresh snow blanketed the town, reflecting the light of a nearly full moon. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air as they walked slowly down the deserted Main Street. "I have something for you," Mitchell said, reaching into his coat pocket. "A Christmas gift. I wanted to give it to you privately." He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. Delilah took it with surprised delight. "You didn't need to get me anything." "I wanted to," he replied simply. She carefully untied the ribbon and unwrapped the paper to reveal a small velvet box. Inside nestled a brooch, a delicate silver bird taking flight, its wings set with tiny seed pearls. "Oh, Mitchell," she breathed, touching it gently. "It's beautiful." "I saw it and thought of you," he said, his voice low in the quiet night. Breaking free, taking wing after being caged for so long. Tears pricked at Delilah's eyes, not of sadness but of being so perfectly understood. "I love it, thank you." He took the brooch from its box and carefully pinned it to her shawl. As he stepped back, something in his expression changed, a deepening, an intensity that made her heart race. "Delilah," he began, then paused, uncharacteristically hesitant. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. Getting to know you, watching you build a new life, seeing your strength and gentleness, it's been a privilege. For me as well," she whispered, sensing that something momentous hung in the balance. Mitchell took her gloved hands in his. "I know it hasn't been long since you gained your freedom. I understand if you want more time to just be yourself without any man making claims on you." He drew a deep breath, his dark eyes holding hers in the moonlight. "But I find I can't let another day pass without telling you that I love you, Delilah, deeply and completely." The words she'd both hoped for and feared hung in the crystalline air between them. Love, such a simple word for such a complex feeling. Thomas had claimed to love her too, once upon a time. But this felt different, not a consuming fire that would burn her to ash, but a steady flame offering warmth and light. "You don't have to say anything now," Mitchell continued, misinterpreting her silence. "I just wanted you to know, and to tell you that whenever, if ever you're ready, I'll be here." Delilah studied his face, this man who had rescued her in more ways than one. Not just from Thomas's fists, but from a life of quiet desperation, from the belief that she deserved nothing better. He'd shown her kindness without conditions, respect without demands, care without control. "I love you too," she said softly, the words rising from a place of absolute certainty. "I think perhaps I have since the day you stood in my doorway and told Thomas that was enough." Joy transformed Mitchell's features. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his face to hers. Their lips met in a kiss as gentle as falling snow, a promise exchanged without words. When they finally parted, Mitchell rested his forehead against hers. "Merry Christmas, Delilah." "Merry Christmas, Mitchell," she replied, her heart full to bursting with the gift of new love, freely given and joyfully received. New Beginnings Dress Shop opened its doors on a bright January morning in 1876, with Delilah proudly cutting the ribbons strung across the entrance. Half the town turned out for the occasion, including Mrs. Sullivan and the hotel staff, who cheered loudest of all. Mitchell stood at her side, his quiet pride evident in every glance. The shop flourished immediately. Delilah's skill with a needle, combined with her innate sense of what styles would flatter different figures, quickly made her establishment the favorite of Silver Spring's female population. She hired a young apprentice, 16-year-old Emma Foster, who showed remarkable talent and enthusiasm for learning the trade. By spring, Delilah had expanded her offerings to include not just women's clothing but fine embroidery, baby layettes, and wedding trousseau. She moved from her room at the hotel to a small but charming apartment above the shop, furnished piece by piece with items she selected herself, the first home that truly belonged to her alone, except that she wasn't alone for long. On a perfect evening in late April, with wildflowers carpeting the hills around Silver Springs, Mitchell asked her to become his wife. They were married in June in a simple ceremony in the town's white clapboard church, with Mrs. Sullivan standing as Delilah's matron of honor and Judge Hollister performing the service. "I take you, Delilah, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Mitchell vowed, his deep voice steady as he slipped a gold band onto her finger. To have and to hold, to honor and cherish, to protect and respect all the days of my life. The words echoed her previous vows to Thomas, yet everything about this moment felt different: the man before her, the community surrounding them, and most importantly, the woman she had become. This time, she entered marriage not as a desperate orphan seeking security, but as a whole person choosing to share her life with an equal partner. "I take you, Mitchell, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she replied, her voice clear and sure. "To have and to hold, to honor and cherish, to support and respect all the days of my life." They began their married life in a comfortable house on the edge of town, close enough for both to walk to work but far enough to enjoy some privacy. Mitchell continued as Marshal, earning the town's respect for his fair-mindedness and steady judgment. Delilah balanced her thriving business with creating a welcoming home, finding joy in both endeavors. The years that followed brought challenges, of course. Silver Springs grew rapidly as the railroad came through, bringing new opportunities, but also occasional lawlessness that kept Mitchell busier than ever. Delilah's business expanded to include a second location in Carson City, managed by Emma once she completed her apprenticeship. There were difficult pregnancies, including one heartbreaking loss that tested their faith and resilience. But there was also immeasurable joy. The birth of their son, James, in 1877, followed by twins Sarah and Samuel in 1880, filled their home with laughter and activity. Mitchell proved to be a devoted father, as gentle with his children as he was with their mother. Each night, he helped tuck them into bed, telling stories of brave settlers and noble lawmen that set their young imaginations afire. As the children grew, so did the bonds between Delilah and Mitchell. Their passion for each other never dimmed, instead deepening into a rich partnership built on mutual respect and unwavering support. He remained her strongest advocate as she expanded her business ventures, while she provided the stable, loving home he'd never known as a child. Sometimes at night, lying beside her sleeping husband, Delilah would think back to that moment in 1875 when he'd stood in her doorway and said the words that changed everything. "He won't touch you again." She'd been too afraid then to believe that freedom was possible, too broken to imagine the life she now lived. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1896, their children now young adults pursuing their own dreams, Mitchell presented Delilah with a special gift: her mother's doll, newly restored by a craftsman in San Francisco, alongside all the other treasures Thomas had sold so long ago. "How?" she asked, astonished, cradling the familiar porcelain face. Mitchell smiled, the silver now dominant in his dark hair but his eyes still vibrant. "I've been tracking them down for years. Some were easy. Harrington kept good records, others took more searching. But I wanted you to have back everything that was taken from you." Tears filled Delilah's eyes as she carefully arranged the items on their mantelpiece: the doll, the quilt, the silver frame now holding a faded photograph of her parents, the pearl hair combs she'd thought lost forever. "Thank you," she whispered, turning to embrace him. "But you know, as precious as these are, they're just things. The real treasure has been our life together, what we've built, the family we've raised, the love we've shared." Mitchell kissed her softly, his arms strong around her waist. "When I found you, you were like these treasures, valuable but hidden, your worth unrecognized by the man who should have cherished you most. All I did was see you, Delilah. You did the rest yourself." "We did it together," she corrected gently, "just as we've done everything since." That night, as moonlight spilled through their bedroom window, Delilah Nash reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment: from a frightened, abused wife to a successful businesswoman, beloved wife, and proud mother. The path hadn't always been straight or easy, but each step had led her exactly where she was meant to be. In the arms of the man who had shown her that love should lift you up, never tear you down. And as she drifted to sleep beside him, secure in his embrace, Delilah knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the greatest courage isn't facing danger head-on, it's taking that first step toward a new beginning, even when you're afraid of what might lie ahead. For her, that step had led to a life beyond her wildest dreams, a a love that healed old wounds, and the precious freedom to become the woman she was always meant to be.